All right. Hi, folks. Welcome today to a discussion on social emotional learning in the time of COVID. My name is Frances Hogan. I'm an adjunct instructor, a PhD candidate in early childhood education, and a residency director at NYU. And I'm joined today with Dr. Erin O'Connor, who is a co-founder of Scientific Mommy. She is also the director of NYU's early childhood education program. She holds a doctorate in human development and psychology, as well as a master's in teaching and a master in school psychology. And she has an extensive research and publication history in social emotional learning, early childhood development. So we're really excited to have Erin and Scientific Mommy joining us today. So Erin, do you want to tell us a little bit about Scientific Mommy?
Thanks so much. That was a nice introduction. And it's nice to be here. So Scientific Mommy really sort of has been in my head for a decade, but in reality, in existence for only about a year. It's something that Robin Newhouse, an advanced doctoral student at NYU, and I founded to really bring research to parents and teachers that might not be accessible to them because it's, in these journals that reside only, online that you can get through university and all these things. And all this important information is just sort of not accessible in a way that it can be used and there can be benefits to it. And also at times, the media might take parts, cherry pick research findings or misinterpret research findings. And that can lead to a lot of anxiety for parents, unnecessary anxiety for parents and teachers. So we're really hoping that by just providing, the facts and allowing people to make their own sort of decisions, that could take some of this anxiety out of the conversation.
Fantastic. And if folks aren't already, I recommend you look up Scientific Mommy or follow them on Instagram. They really do provide bite-sized research snippets that are really easily digestible to folks who are not in the academic or research world. So really great work there. I want to let folks know that today's conversation might look a little different than a typical Scientific Mommy conversation. It serves a dual purpose. So this is a conversation not only for parents and caregivers or folks who might be joining for Scientific Mommy. This is also for my undergraduate and graduate students at NYU. So this is for current and future educators, students, parents, and caregivers. So this will be kind of a joint PowerPoint discussion. We have one or two videos to share. So just so you know, if you're joining and you're wondering what this looks like, it's a little different. But we're so excited to have Erin here. And so we'll go ahead and jump in. The big questions we're going to cover today are namely, what is social emotional learning, right? A lot of folks have heard of SEL, or you may have heard of it as a buzzword or a phrase, but not really sure what exactly is it. So we'll talk about what is it and why should we care? How do we then support SEL, social emotional learning, and social emotional skill development in young learners, and particularly thinking about COVID and the time of virtual learning, right? We've all been through it this year, and it's likely to continue in some fashion. So thinking about how does social emotional learning change in the time of COVID, and knowing that many students will be going back to in-person classrooms in the fall of 2021, we're going to answer some questions about how can we help children who are at home be ready for the transition either to school for the first time or for those returning to school, perhaps going to kindergarten or first grade. So all of our questions today will adapt based on COVID and virtual learning. So we wanted to start out sharing a short video on social emotional learning. And this is from CASTLE, which is the collaborative for, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name, but it's a fantastic resource, and I'll find the name after we play the video, but it's a great resource for all things related to social emotional learning. So I'm going to play the video and then we'll go from there.
Social emotional learning is essential.
It's the tools that kids need to be resilient, to be problem solvers, to be good people.
SEL is really about the holistic development of young people. SEL is trying to bring a balance to the individual and what are the personal competencies you need to develop to be successful. How do you pull them all together so that kids can relate and navigate the world more effectively?
The myth was that knowledge was information that could be bolted onto a brain like any other kind of mechanical part. The truth is, knowledge is constructive. The truth is, all learning is relational. The truth is that emotion drives attention, and attention drives learning.
Social and emotional learning is about how you do school. It's about what the student experiences, what the student learns, how teachers teach.
We can think about schools and classrooms, out-of-school time spaces, families, etc., as places where there's an exchange of knowledge about the world, knowledge about yourself, and knowledge about the other persons that you're interacting with. All of those kinds of experiences, I think, help form and expose and shape the ways in which young people understand themselves and other people.
And we start talking about the whole child. Does your child understand self-awareness? Do they understand social awareness? Do they make good decisions? Are they responsible? And then we start talking about what that applies to academics and looking at all the essential skills we need them to be successful in life.
Children learn when their heart is open, engaged, connected, and filled with purpose.
Learning is magical, and through SEL, we can create conditions that allow all kids to access that magic.
So that's from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And as they say, the primary goal of SEL is really to acquire a fundamental set of social and emotional competencies. So when we think about what is SEL, as you saw in the video, this is from Castle. It's sort of their core competency wheel. And they've got 5 big core competencies that they consider foundational to social emotional learning. Things like self-awareness, so knowing yourself, knowing others, your strengths and weaknesses or limitations, self-management, right? Effectively managing your impulse control, inhibitory control, as we may say, when thinking about executive functioning skills, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So how this might play out in an early childhood classroom is, do you have the social and emotional wherewithal to say to your neighbor, I would like to borrow your purple crayon, instead of biting your neighbor or hitting your neighbor or taking the crayon just because you want it? I mean, we may laugh, but that's a really great example of having the social and emotional awareness. And as you can see on this, in their circle, it's not just in classrooms and schools through sort of direct and explicit SEL curriculum and instruction or school-wide practices and policies, but we also have SEL building over into homes and communities through family and community partnerships. So with all that said, Erin, how do you see SEL playing out in different contexts or environments?
Excuse me. Well, I think in early childhood, especially, we think of children as having sort of these 2 primary environments that they're functioning in, right? Home and school, preschool. And I think so much of, the importance of self plays out in the relationships that children have in those environments. So like your great example with the crayon, by showing the wherewithal and having the sort of self-regulation skills to approach your friend and ask them for the crayon rather than physically acting on your desire for the crayon, that's going to help you have a stronger relationship with your peer than if you are aggressive, and also a better relationship with your teacher if you're able to sort of have these skills when you are in the classroom. And then the same thing also, we don't think about it, I think, as much at home, because we're thinking, you're more yourself, quote unquote, probably at home than you are at school. But having those skills at home also helps in terms of our relationships with, our parents, with our siblings. So really having these fundamental abilities to self-regulate, to be self-aware, are so important from early years, as we're going to talk about a little later, because we really want to have that strong foundation.
Fantastic. And often we're moving sort of into, we understand what SEL is. It's really developing the competencies to get along with others, to recognize emotions, to label, to understand how you relate to others. But why does SEL matter? Well, in particular for a classroom, we know that social emotional learning programs really provide schools with evidence-based framework, right? Research-backed frameworks to support academic performance. So supporting math and ELA or English learning skills, through enhancing social emotional skills. So a lot of what we see in terms of academic supports, we know that providing support for children socially and emotionally, developing their SEL skills really ends up benefiting them, not just in a social and emotional realm, not just in an interpersonal realm, but later in their academic skills, their ability, their readiness to learn, their readiness and their ability to grasp academic concepts to prepare them for the next grade level or the next whatever comes down the academic road. So really, when we think about SEL, we know that it can increase engagement and attention. It can reduce problem behaviors. It can foster supportive learning environments, and it really supports systematic instruction in the classroom. So I would ask Erin, what are your thoughts here in terms of why does SEL matter, even though I've shared a little bit?
Well, I think, as we've been talking about, it matters so much in terms of it's also a pathway through which school can impact these academic outcomes. Because if we don't have the ability to focus in the classroom, if we don't have the ability to get along with peers, if we're more stressed out about our social environment than about sort of taking in information, that's going to, of course, have a negative impact. But I think too, we have to think about a lot of this developmentally. I guess as a developmental psychologist, that's sort of like always my first thing is like, okay, well, what's developmentally appropriate? And that the sort of the skills that we have when we're young, we build on those, right? And there's a developmental theory of cascading effects. So this idea of if you have a lot of something at the beginning, then you can just keep building on that, versus if you don't, you might sort of be constantly losing in relation to your peers, sort of this ability to whatever it is, in this case to self-regulate, to have these social emotional skills. So that's why I think when we think about the environment that we want young children to be in, it's one that supports these skills, and that might look a little different to some people than they might expect at first, which we're going to talk a lot about later, but really the focus being on play and developing these skills.
Fantastic. So we know what SEL is, we know why it matters, not only for supporting students as social and emotional beings, right, which we all are, but also their academic supports, thinking about cascading developmental theory, about building on and supporting learning going forward. But I want to bring us to the research on social emotional learning. So what's the research on SEL? We know that there, and this comes from Child Development Journal, but we know that there's an extensive body of really intense research on social emotional learning, everything from randomized controlled trials to longitudinal, meaning long-term follow-ups, multiple replications, or basically repeats of studies that have been done that really demonstrate that teaching social and emotional learning skills and behaviors gets academic results. So this is from a 2013 I think 2017 meta-analysis that providing social emotional learning supports in the classroom gave 11% academic gains, which is really huge. So what is your take on sort of research on social emotional learning? What is it? What do we know?
Well, I think it's such an exciting field because it's been growing for decades. So there is a really solid body of research and knowledge there. And I think what's exciting too is that it's been conducted for children all different ages, different school environments, different home environments. And we see these positive, long-lasting effects sort of across all these different environments. So that's something that in other research contexts we don't always see, especially when we think about sort of interventions, especially academic interventions. We do not see the effects that we do in terms of children's long-term development and shorter-term development that we do with research on social emotional programs. So I think, we can confidently say that it matters and it definitely should be supported.
Definitely. And so when you're talking about academic interventions, for example, those are things that might be like a math intervention or tutoring or an after school reading program that provides targeted academic supports only, right? No social emotional learning. And what we know from research, from your research, from others, from a really broad body of work that you've said, is that if we're just focusing on the academic skills, you might see an increase in a student's ability to do math or their ELA scores in the short term, but providing that social emotional support really leads to long-term gains that we don't see with those academic interventions.
And I think what's interesting too is that there's been research that has compared the effects of social emotional interventions to academic interventions. So they randomly assign children to either an academic or a social emotional intervention, and the children in the social emotional intervention are outperforming on the academic skills that the other intervention was focused on. So I think that just sort of says it all right there.
Yeah, it's wild. You would think that you give them the academic supports and they would flourish, and yet when we really support children and young learners and we recognize how they're developing in terms of self-awareness, responsibility, interpersonal skills, inhibitory control, all of those things, we then see them outperform their peers who are supposedly learning all the math skills they need and all the ELA skills they need. So that's a really exciting boost for the promise and the value of social emotional learning and interventions. So this some information here that comes from research in social emotional learning. And as you mentioned, there are generally positive findings in terms of a broad body of research, but there are some mixed effects from social emotional learning programs, right? When researchers study them, not all of them show that social emotional learning is positive. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think, I think there are many different reasons why this could be the case, but I think what has really come out of it is that they've been able to pinpoint why some programs are effective or more effective than others. And really, it's not just about focusing necessarily on one teacher or one classroom. It's really thinking about these universal interventions, going back to sort of the conversation we had earlier about, aligning home and school and, thinking about children in both of these contexts and how, that is basically, especially when you're young, often the only two environments where you're spending a significant amount of time. So if we're only focusing on the school and we don't also think about the home environment, then it kind of makes sense that maybe some of these programs that we're only focusing at the school level or at this classroom level, we weren't finding necessarily as many benefits. So I think the mixed findings is in a way a positive thing because it's enabled the field to really figure out what works and why.
Definitely. And with that, so we also know that there's limited information on the long-term impacts of social emotional learning programs. So thinking longitudinally, that means like those long-term, maybe 10-year program or 10-year studies, 20-year studies. So an example from a 2017 meta-analysis, which is sort of analyzing a bunch of other journal articles and data to see what are the overall trends. They found that 50 studies only had a year of follow-up or less, meaning these studies were only looking not very long term. There were only 13 studies with 2 years of follow-up, so looking to see if the gains that the researchers had found actually sort of held up over the long term. And then we can see there, by the time you get to looking at 15 years of follow-up, there were only 6 studies that really had truly longitudinal looks at what was actually happening. Were these social emotional learning programs or interventions or supports actually lasting in the long term? So why do you think there's such limited information, and why can it be so difficult to get these long-term impacts in research?
Well, I think, so much of it is just, it's a practical issue of it's very costly in terms of, the number of people you need to hire to follow up on folks who have been in a study and who have moved all over the country and the world. And so there's just a lot of, monetary restrictions, as well as sometimes it's really hard to find people. I mean, little easier now than maybe when a lot of these studies were first conducted. But it's still hard to find folks often that are, involved in an intervention when they're 5, when they're 20. So I think, those are sort of the two main reasons we don't have a lot of longitudinal data. I think what's interesting is that when we think about research in early childhood, there's a lot also, right, looking at the quality of the classroom environment, which again, sort of that intersects definitely with social emotional learning, right? A high quality classroom is one where all these skills are, valued and taught. But the two projects that really looked at the long-term impacts, right, which we, talk about a lot, but are Abecedarian and the Perry Preschool Project. And billions of dollars went into those in terms of being able to collect the data, to follow up, and they did find that the quality mattered so much. But I think that's an example of those two studies are still cited, and they were back in like the 60s because they are two of the most robust longitudinal studies out there that were, because just of all these constraints, others have not been able to been done. But yeah.
And definitely, I think, as you said, it's an exciting time for social emotional learning researchers and folks in the field, because so much of what we're learning and seeing is, right, the research builds on itself, right? When we see positive gains, that allows other people to say, this is important. We need to pay attention to social emotional learning. We need to see what interventions work, what interventions don't. You talked about sort of a universal application across classrooms, across schools. So with all of that, what do you see sort of going forward with the future of social emotional learning research and potentially making causal arguments? And maybe for folks who aren't aware, just explain what a causal argument is.
Sure. So a lot of research, we're not able to make these causal statements. So we don't know, if children are enrolled in an intervention, but they're also experiencing all these different environments that are unrelated to the intervention. If the intervention has an impact on children's social emotional development or academic development, maybe it's the intervention, but also maybe it's all these other different factors in their life. So it's kind of hard to tease out truly what's causing behavior, right? That's just an issue in social science research in general, but definitely has been an issue with looking at the impacts of interventions. But more recent sort of methodological, I don't want to say savviness, but just this, a better understanding kind of how we can isolate effects has led us to realize that there's really this gold standard for examining the impacts of anything on development. And that's what we call the randomized controlled trial, right? So that is just taking a large group and then literally randomly assigning them to the intervention or not the intervention. So the thought is if the intervention has an impact, then it's because of the intervention and not because of other factors, because the probability that, people are going to be experiencing similar environments that are the same in both groups, because they're just randomly in the group or not. And we're finding that. And even, our research team that did an early social emotional intervention with children and followed them up when they were in middle school, found an effect of the intervention, and the children had been randomly assigned. So, we're really able to make the argument that it was because of the intervention that children were showing these gains in not only social skills, but also academic skills. So it's exciting.
It is. It's very exciting. And I'll say for folks, if you're more interested or you have questions, you can look up randomized control trials, or RCTs. That's sort of the gold standard in research, right? Because it gives us, it randomly assigns, but also, like Erin mentioned, makes the probability that there are outside factors contributing to one group's academic gains or the outcomes of the intervention, that those outside influences, those contexts, those environmental factors are the same for both groups, whether they receive the intervention or not. And you can see here, if you're wondering what these interesting puppet cartoons are, this is from a social emotional learning intervention research project that Erin and I were both a part of, called the Insights into Children's Temperament. There is a fantastic website, but Erin, do you want to just say a little bit about Insights for folks who are interested?
Sure. So Insights is basically, it is a social emotional intervention, but really the premise of it is that children have different temperaments or personality types, and that we in order to truly be able to engage with each other and the environment, in the most positive way possible, we have to understand sort of how we approach things and how people approach things, so that we can understand why there might be a connection or a disconnection at first between ourselves and our environment or our peers. And so Insights is all around using these puppets that you see here, because it's geared for kindergarten children as well as first grade children, and using these puppets to help you identify your sort of personality type, and then to also talk about other personality types. And really the overarching goal is self-awareness, other awareness, and using that awareness in a way to sort of self-regulate. And there is a great website as well that you can look up. If you look up Insights into Children's Temperament, you will find, and a lot of research articles that we have both been a part of on Insights.
Yeah, and I bring that up because I think as we talk about social emotional learning, and you bring up temperament, which we won't talk about today, we notice the more we think in a socially, emotionally geared way towards supporting students, towards supporting teachers, parents, and caregivers, we notice how everything else ties in, right? Self-awareness involves temperament, involves your environment, involves stressors, involves how do you handle all of those things. So I love that SEL is moving towards the space of making these causal arguments based on randomized control trials. And it also gives us the sort of space to look forward to say, what else can we make connections to, right? You mentioned quality of classroom. So a high quality classroom, what's involved there, and how does that connect to social emotional learning? Really exciting spaces for research to go.
Definitely.
So we've talked about what SEL is, why we should care, what's the research. So now sort of wondering, okay, well, how do we support SEL in young learners? And so folks may be familiar with what these are. These are sort of mood meters. You may have seen something similar in your classroom growing up, or you may see them in your child's classroom, or if you are a New York City school teacher in an early childhood classroom, you may be familiar with these. But it's really about practicing emotional intelligence and expanding children's emotional vocabulary. So one way that many New York City classrooms are trying to support social emotional learning is through the Ruler program, RULER. And it's designed by the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And it's a tool that was developed to sort of build off of CASEL's 5 core competencies. So if you remember the core wheel of those 5 competencies we talked about at the beginning, Ruler is about, and I have to write down because I always forget, but it's about recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotions. So you might see in a childhood classroom, you'll see one of these sort of 4 colors of a mood meter. And sometimes they may just be colors, right? So you can see on the left, red is sort of high in energy and more unpleasant. So feelings like angry, scared, or anxious. Blue is low in energy and more unpleasant. So sad, disappointed, or lonely. The green would be low in energy and more pleasant, calm, tranquil, relaxed. And the yellow is high energy and more pleasant. So excited, curious, and happy. And you might see in younger classrooms something that looks like this on the right, where it's a mood meter with just a couple different words. So hyper, excited, joyful, alone, unhappy, tired. And some mood meters get really extensive with lots of different words to describe. But it's a really great tool to help young children, again, recognize what emotion am I feeling? Where do I feel? Do I feel high energy, low energy, pleasant or unpleasant? Understanding what that means, but really importantly, labeling. So when we talk about how are you feeling, we often want to move. We want to move from just I'm happy or sad to I'm happy, sad, mad, glad, and then really expanding from there. So it's a space to expand children's emotional vocabularies while also adding on additional strengthening supports about what does it mean to understand feeling joyful? What does it mean to feel content? And if you're in sort of a high energy, upset, frustrated, hyper, or maybe low energy and unpleasant, like alone and unhappy or tired, what does that mean for regulating myself? What does that mean for regulating my emotions in a classroom? What does that mean if I'm 4.5 years old and I'm feeling really hyper? What does that mean for me with relation to my peers? So that's sort of a recognizable component and a way that we can support young learners. So for teachers, that might be in the classroom, but at home, things you can do is support your children in sort of naming and expressing, what is this emotion you're feeling? What is this feeling you're feeling? How do we describe it? Any thoughts, Erin, on ruler or similar mood meters that you might see?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I really like ruler because I think it does give children this ability, or to express multiple emotions and to understand that it's not just about these, sad, mad, glad. There's a lot more that we feel. But also, I think what's interesting is that we used to see these like happy faces and sad faces for emotions. So, if you were tired, you had the little sad face. But I think what we've learned as a field is that what's most important is supporting children in the emotions that they are feeling and not labeling those as like a good thing or a bad thing. So instead of having a smiley face or a sad face, we have these more, neutral sort of colors that we use to help children identify their emotions. So, because we never want children to think that feeling sad is like it's a bad thing. I mean, it's hard, and it's something that, you definitely want to help children get over and get through, but it's not something you want to dismiss, right? You definitely want to make children understand that they are going to experience all these different emotions, and that's perfectly normal and perfectly okay. And it's more about how we handle those emotions than feeling them or not feeling them, and whether they be positive or negative, right? So exactly. I think it's so good that they've moved away from these smiley faces.
Yeah, and I think it's I love you mentioning sort of not labeling maybe feeling tired or frustrated as a negative emotion, as a negative feeling. And it's something that parents and caregivers, teachers model it in the classroom, talking about emotions. Maybe when we come in and start the day, we pick a word or we pick an emotion that we're feeling that fits on the chart. But that's something you parents and caregivers can do at home, is talking about how are you feeling and acknowledging, like you said, we don't ever want to dismiss feelings, right? You don't want to say, well, don't feel sad. I mean, gosh, it's COVID. Many of us have been inside for a year. I would be impressed if no one felt sad during that time. And we want to prepare our young learners to know that, yes, you're going to feel a range of emotions, a range of feelings throughout life. There are going to be times when you're joyful and proud or content and calm. And there will be times when you're mad and worried and sad and alone. And that's okay. Like you said, it's not so much the emotion itself, but what do we do next? How do we understand it? How do we regulate? How do we express what we're feeling to others so that we can safely go forward? So I agree. I love getting rid of the smiley and the frowny faces. So another way to support social emotional skills and skill development in early childhood is through play. And I know Erin has seen this video, and I wanted to play it for folks here. It's a little cheesy, but it comes from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I think it really speaks to the importance of play. So we'll watch it, and then Erin can talk a little bit more.
Hey Luke, come check this out. Come on, buddy. Hurry up!
Come on, kiddo. Do your homework, okay?
Oh no, what are you wearing? Can you just go in the other room and watch your show? It would be a shame for you to get sick at this time of year.
Is he okay? He's perfectly healthy, except I still need to write him a prescription.
Play isn't just fun and games. It's also critical to raising healthy and happy children. Through play, kids learn how to solve problems, manage their emotions, relieve stress, and more. The American Academy of Pediatrics now encourages doctors to write kids prescriptions for play.
Hey, super dude, 5 minutes till homework time, okay?
Bet you can't catch me.
To learn about the benefits of play, go to thegeniusofplay.org.
So it's a little cheesy, but tell me your thoughts. Why is play so important?
Well, I think, which they do definitely get at in the video. It helps children learn their self-regulation skills. It helps children express their emotions. And I think as both teachers and as parents, what's also so beneficial about when we are able to play with children is that we get an insight into maybe what they're feeling, their understanding of a topic that we might not get in these, sort of question and answer sessions that we might be more tempted to have sometimes with our children. And, especially when we're thinking about COVID, and even now that things have gotten, a little better, still it's very scary for young children, not knowing, exactly what this virus is, what is a virus, sort of, should I be worried about my parents getting sick, my grandparents, but they might not necessarily be telling you that, but you'll see it in their play. So they might, play that somebody's sick, or they might play that they get sick. And that's just a great way to open up conversations with children around these topics that are very important to them, but they might not be bringing up in, a manner that we might as an adult, right?
Definitely.
Right. And also, the play therapy, research on play therapy too, I think has really informed a lot of this, in thinking about how play helps children express an emotion that might be difficult. So whether it be, frustration, anger, to express that in, this environment where they might not be themselves, they might be somebody else, so it's like allowing them to kind of be a little bit removed, but also to express that emotion. And then an opportunity for us adults to then talk to them about that. How are you feeling? What do you want to do? What could, whatever character you are, what could they do? And so it's just a really good way to get a deep understanding of children.
Definitely. And I think I love that you mentioned that we can sort of get insight to children and what they're feeling or how they're managing emotions that they may not share with us in conversation. So it may be that Mr. Bear gets sick and we have to take care of Mr. Bear, and then that can lead to conversations about, what is Mr. Bear feeling? I wonder if Mr. Bear is scared. Does he feel safe? Does Mr. Bear have friends that he can talk to, right? So that may be a little cheesy example, but that's a great way for children to express what they may not want to or know how to say to us as adults in our conversations. So fantastic. And just a note, Erin had mentioned, children may express, and especially with COVID, with other things like police shootings and issues going on, that having difficult conversations with your children about these big feelings and big emotions can be trying for many of us. And I know Scientific Mommy has some interviews and other resources up about how to have those conversations. So that is, if parents or caregivers or other folks are interested, definitely check them out. They've got some great resources there. But we know that play is great. We would love to see play. We want to see it happening. But given COVID, a lot of us, like I mentioned, we've been indoors, or the opportunities for children to get that outdoor play, to interact with peers in the past year has been severely limited in some cases. And many times they are playing, I put in air quotes, but they may be playing, but swiping on a screen, watching a program. A lot of screen time has been involved in play. And I think that leads us really nicely into, again, with the American Academy of Pediatrics, they're sort of not sure what I want to say here. They're the big Goombas in terms of coming up with what do we talk about, or what's recommended for public health as it relates to child development and early childhood. And now the AAP had previously come out with a recommendation of no screen time for children under 2 and less than 2 hours for older children and teens. With COVID, with virtual learning, we know that that's just terribly unrealistic for folks. But they've since adapted their recommendations given virtual learning and COVID, and they've said they still don't recommend screen time for children under age 2. Except for video chatting. So things like FaceTime, Zoom calls, or Skype with family members. And so I wonder why. And I know we talk about this thing, maybe some of my students have heard of it or other folks may be aware, but it's serve and return. So what is serve and return, and why is it helpful with video chatting?
So I think that's a great question, especially in light of there was such an emphasis sort of before COVID on no screen time under 2. And then now here we are, and screens are inevitable. But what is not inevitable is it's using the screen as a babysitter, right? Or as a pacifier, as some people call it, for younger children. So because this idea of serve and return, right, as the child expresses, verbally or non-verbally something, even, with my 1-year-old, she's babbling, but I then talk back to her like, oh yes, you're right, Haley, that is really interesting. So it's just this, this constant, like in tennis, right? The ball goes back and forth. So you're constantly engaging with the child. And we can do that, on screens with FaceTime and Zoom and whatnot. And can play with grandparents, and they can have all these interactions and evolve serve and return, which I think just we didn't appreciate necessarily maybe before COVID, how much that could happen. So I think in some respects, that's a positive thing that came out of it, because I think, maybe at least for our family, there's more time actually doing stuff with grandparents because, like they don't live here, but we could get on FaceTime, which we didn't used to that much. So I think that is something that one good thing that maybe has come out of it. But also I think, the larger sort of issue, or whatever you want to say about screens, is that as long as there is that, some sort of engagement, real time, even with older children, some sort of serve and return, it can be beneficial. So I know there was a research study that came out recently that boys, they found, were actually doing better during COVID social and emotionally than girls. And their hypothesis is that boys were doing things like Roblox, Minecraft, these games that involved interacting in real time with other people around some sort of shared goal, whereas girls were more likely to be on like Instagram, where it's much more sort of evaluative and not like in the moment. So you might put something up that you would never do in the moment, and then if something is said about you, you can't reply in the moment. So even as children get older, this idea, it's not really necessarily about the screen, but it's about the serve and return and what's going on the screen. Sorry, that was a little tangent, but I thought that was so interesting about
I think that's great. And I think that really speaks to the engagement part of it, right? Because I think oftentimes parents hear, oh, too much screens, or screen time is bad, or I'm a bad parent for letting my child play on the iPad. But we know that they can be engaging. So those educational games that are, marketed towards young children, you really want to be discerning, right? There's FaceTime, video time, chatting, where you can have live interactions with other people that you can see on the screen. But there are also games, you mentioned Roblox, Minecraft, other games, or activities that kids can do where there's real-time interaction. What folks want to try to avoid is overdoing it on these media games, things that may even be marketed towards young children that really don't have any sort of engagement. Swiping or tapping a screen isn't necessarily engaging because you're looking for that responsiveness, either the responsiveness of another person, of another player, when you're creating your virtual world where you can chat in real time and have those conversations. But that engagement, that serve and return, is really what you're looking for. And I've put on here, there's a link to I think it's from Healthy Families, and it's through the American Academy of Pediatrics website. So if folks just Google it, they have tools on creating a family media plan, which I know folks may say, like, I already have enough things to do. We're already struck at home, we've got a system down. But it gives you tools for children of different ages, different recommendations, setting goals and routines around bedtime, maybe shared meal times, and what to do with devices. So for folks who are looking for resources there, that's a great tool to use based on your child's age and developmental stage, what's appropriate for them and how you can support healthy media. And we've got family in the background. That's all right. We've got family. We're all COVID. We're all dealing with it. But I think it's also important that we note, like Erin said, being discerning about educational media, and thinking about engaging in interactive resources. So things like Sesame Street. We might see baby Haley on there. Look at that cutie. So again, but thinking about social emotional learning and media resources, PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, Learning Media has some great SEL resources. So folks can look these up, and you'll see on the left, they've got different videos, different tools, things like Daniel Tiger, but they've broken it down into different social emotional skill components like self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making. So if parents, caregivers, teachers, and educators are looking for some tools or resources to support social emotional learning at home, this is another fantastic resource. And I'll just plug finally that CASEL, again, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL, is a great resource in terms of policy briefs, research, tools, things you can do in the community and in school. So those are some resources and ways that we can support social emotional development in our young learners. So we're kind of slowly wrapping up. So we know what SEL is, why it's important, what the research is, and how we support SEL development. But particularly in a COVID virtual learning space, we have many children who are either transitioning back to school. They may have been in person for part of pre-K or kindergarten, and now they're going back into a classroom after having been virtual. Or there may be some children who are going into a classroom, a physical classroom, for the first time. So what are some ways we can help children at home be ready for the transition back to school? I think the big one, and Erin, I'll let you talk about, is aligning conversations between school and home. So what does that mean to align those conversations?
So I think, so often we are very aware that our children are in these two different environments, but sometimes we don't think about how those two environments are, intertwined, whether like we recognize it or not, because children are bringing in what they have experienced at home into the school and vice versa. So if there's a big disconnect between sort of the message that is sent to children at home and the message that's sent to them at school, it can be a little bit confusing and can cause especially younger children and older children to not necessarily feel as comfortable in school as they might. So if school, and I know we're going to talk about this in a minute, but if school is really focused on building these skills, helping children transition back, and maybe it doesn't look as quote unquote academic as some parents might expect. And then if at home they're hearing their parents, and a lot of sort of this disconnect often happens not directly with conversation parents are having with their children, but they overhear, right? Caregivers talking, and they're like, oh, they're not doing anything in school. It's a waste of time. So that's like this real disconnect for the child, right? Because they are working hard at school, and they're in, especially during and after COVID, having to really put themselves out there. And if the message at home is that, oh, well, that's nothing, like what are they doing at school? That can be very jarring. So I think making sure that there is this mutual understanding between schools and families is going to be, always is, but especially now is extremely important. And then also just thinking about other ways to help children transition back. We just talked about play, but role playing with children, what this is going to look like can be really effective. And then I thought it was interesting the other day, I was talking to a woman about this, and she was saying, it's so important. She's a clinical psychologist. She said, I think it's going to be so important for when we bring the conversations up with children. So she's like, for younger children, and I hadn't really thought about this. She's like, you might want to wait until like the week before school starts, because you don't want it to have them have time to like ruminate on it, right? And I thought that was interesting. So I was like, oh, play is always a good thing, and role playing is always a good thing. And she's like, yes, but you don't want to make it seem like a really big thing early on too, and give children a lot of time to worry. So I thought that was just an interesting observation. And then, lastly, sort of thinking about how we can, again, connecting home and school. It's another conversation for another day, but attachment research shows like the importance of these transitional objects, right, that we talk about. So allowing kids to bring a teddy bear from home, allowing kids, whatever is going to make them feel like that. A lot of children have been at home for so long, right? And they really are looking to only their primary caregivers as, sources of support. And they might feel a little upset when they're not there in the classroom. So just allowing them to bring something that reminds them of home.
Definitely. And I think it can be helpful too to remember that, as we're preparing our children, young learners to go into the classroom or back into the classroom, many of us may have been working from home for, 6 to 8 months in our sweatpants and a professional top. And now we're going to have to go back into an office with, professional attire. We're going to have to readjust. So recognizing that those social emotional skills that we have to use to adjust, we really need to doubly support our young learners, our young children, because they don't necessarily have the skills that we do to go back or to deal with these big life transitions. And I think you said it really nicely. A lot of folks may hear things like, oh, school isn't even hard this year, or what is my child even learning? Or, will my child be prepared for assessments like state assessments or academics? Are they going to be ready for first grade? Are they going to be ready for second grade? And I think this really speaks to a need for all of us to reframe our perspective. This year, COVID has been an unprecedented, huge change in all of our lives. It's a lot of uncertainty that has been throughout it, right? Not knowing how long it will last. What does it mean if you get sick? What is the vaccine? What does that look like? What will our summer look like? There are a lot of unanswered questions that we as adults struggle with. And so again, speaking to the importance of social emotional learning skills, we really need to support our young learners. Academics may not look the same this year. They may not look the same next year, and that's okay. What we really want to make sure is that our children feel safe and supported when they go into the classroom, that they feel safe to express their emotions, that they have someone they can talk to, that they're learning how to regulate, that they're learning how to be in space with others. And those are things that may sort of delay the pacing or the set schedule of academics, apologies for any noise, that may delay what we expect or we expect in a typical year, because these are not typical times. And so I think it's important for educators to reframe our perspective. What are we expecting of students? What are parents and caregivers expecting from teachers? Educators may be spending a lot more time supporting students on feeling big feelings, on regulating, on dealing with emotions, on separation anxiety, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. And that doesn't necessarily leave time for strict academics, but this goes back to what we talked about with research, right? We know if folks are worried like, oh, my child's not learning all the academics they need to, or school isn't rigorous enough this year. Well, remember we talked about the research, and we know that if you provide the social emotional learning supports, if you make children feel supported and safe, if you help them express and regulate and understand their emotions, they're going to be better prepared for whatever academic needs, academic challenges come down the line. So I think that's a really helpful perspective for folks to take as we go into this year. Any thoughts?
No, I think that's very well said. I mean, it's just, it's a little bit of uncharted territory for all of us. So I think, there's been a lot of, in the popular press and on things like Instagram about self-care. And, it does sort of start to sound a little bit, I don't know what the right word is, but, you kind of roll your eyes. You're like, okay, yes, I know, like, I'm going to hear this again. But I think it's so true. It's like self-care for us, and kind of allowing our children to engage in whatever is self-care for them, which might, not look academic, or sometimes it might be a little bit much at home, but if it involves being like really energetic and playing and loud, and you're like, oh, but it's their way of self-care too.
Yeah. And again, I think for educators, for parents and caregivers who are worried that their child's going to fall behind, it's a helpful reminder that all the children across the country are dealing with this, with dealing with COVID, with virtual, hybrid, in-person, all sorts of different types of learning. They're all dealing with the uncertainty, the transitions. So we're really supporting all of our learners and not focusing as much on, are you meeting this academic standard that someone has set and said you need to get it by this age at this time, or otherwise you're behind. Recognizing these are not normal times, these are not typical times, and providing that social emotional support will really do them the benefit in the long run. They're going to be much better supported than if you just focus on math, academic, ELA interventions only, if we're not taking care of that self-care part, if we're not really giving our children the space to express, reflect, understand, have conversations about emotions, they're going to be poorly suited when they go into kindergarten, first grade, third grade, fifth grade. So finally, I think this ties it up nicely, but we've talked about how to support for the transition. So what might fall 2021 look like in the classroom? I think probably the biggest thing, the most physical thing folks will notice is PPE, that personal protective equipment. So face masks and face shields. And I know some folks have gotten face masks that have like a clear part around the mouth so you can sort of see people's facial expressions. But for the most part, that's not widely available. Most of us have masks that are not transparent. They cover up our face. And that can make it really difficult for people to recognize emotions, to communicate and understand, right? So much of what we do and what we're working with young children is how do you recognize how someone else is feeling, right? Big smiles, frowny faces, what is their facial expression telling you? And children often look about imitation and mimicry. So for teachers, knowing that your students don't have the opportunity to sort of get that visual recognition of social emotional skills, you can do a lot more modeling. So it might say, for example, right, when I look at my friends' faces, I can tell how they're feeling. If they're smiling or frowning, they can tell me what they're feeling. But I can't see underneath your mask. Can you tell me what you're feeling? So it may seem a little cheesy for us to say, but doing that explicit instruction, talking more explicitly about feelings and modeling SEL can really be helpful in the classroom. And I know, as we mentioned, right, teachers may also be more likely to see things like tantrums, interpersonal conflicts, separation anxiety, or other regressive behaviors that you might not expect for a child's age. So Erin, do you want to talk a little about what that might look like?
Sure. So, I think the big one for young children, like we've mentioned, is separation anxiety, right? So, often by kindergarten, first grade, you're not necessarily seeing so much of it at the beginning of the year because children are used to, the school environment by that point. They're a little older and have a little bit of a better understanding of the teacher being somebody that's supportive and there for them. And, but I think we can expect that second graders, maybe even third graders, are likely going to show signs of separation anxiety because it's been such a different experience. There's been a year where they've been at home, or year at that point it'll be a year and a half when they will have primarily been with their primary caregivers, a lot of them, and they won't have their primary caregiver with them, which they're used to, and school may feel a little scary just because we've put so much emphasis, rightfully so, but on social distancing, on the dangers of not having a mask on, and these things that might make the school environment potentially seem a little scary for kids when they first go back. So that separation anxiety might look different for different kids. Often we're thinking of it as crying and being upset, at the beginning of the day, but maybe it's, like you were saying, maybe it's a temper tantrum. Maybe it comes out in different ways. Maybe it's not engaging in the class. So, maybe it's really withdrawing, and really being aware that these different behaviors that we might not expect from children, especially at different ages, are probably going to show up. It's quote unquote normal. It's, it will get through. We'll get through it. It just might be a little bit of a different start to the year than we're all used to.
Definitely. And yeah, like you're saying, the transition back to school may not be smooth for all the reasons you just said. Going from, when you're unmasked around your family at home, going to a classroom where everybody's masked and it's a classroom full of strangers, that might be intimidating or scary, not wanting to engage, maybe tantruming or acting out, or sort of letting your emotions spill out without regulating. But the transition, smooth or not, it's okay, right? This is what's typical for this time. This is an atypical time. And so what we might consider regressive or behaviors that are not age appropriate, right now, it's okay, right? We want children to feel safe, and they're going to have to struggle with getting back into the swing of things, or getting into the swing of things for the first time. And so if your child is exhibiting separation anxiety in 2nd or 3rd grade, if they are tantruming or doing things that you don't normally see at home or wouldn't expect, or especially if you've had a child who has already been in a classroom, gone to school, then transitioned to virtual learning and is now transitioning back, they might exhibit behaviors or actions that they never did in the classroom before, and now they're coming up for the first time. And it's important to remember that it's not reflective of your parenting. It's not reflective of your worth as a caregiver, right? There's a lot of uncertainty, new transitions, new things, big feelings, big emotions. And it doesn't mean that you've done something wrong. It doesn't mean that your child isn't developmentally prepared. It doesn't mean they're not ready to go to the classroom. It just means that maybe getting into a calm, going into classes with a calm demeanor, going to start the school day and feeling ready to let go of caregiver's hand and walk into the classroom, that might take a little bit longer. It might take a few more weeks for the classroom to seem quote unquote normal this year, and that's perfectly okay. And I know, Erin, I'll let you sort of take on the last bullet point, and I'll give some examples here.
Well, so we talk a lot, right? When we're talking about, becoming a teacher or being a teacher, of making sure that first communication home to parents is a positive one. Really wanting to start the year off on a positive note, even if there might be some things that you need to discuss that don't feel as positive. But I think it's really going to be important to also think with this transition back about, as parents too, we kind of want that first, initial meeting or communication with our child's teacher to be a positive one, even if we're feeling anxious and we don't necessarily understand why they're doing what they're doing, to really first approach, the teacher recognizing like all that they are doing, all that they have been through. And then after, letting them know that you do recognize their worth and their value and all the effort that they're putting in, then if you have a concern, addressing it. But really focusing, we talked a lot about peer relationships, teacher-child relationships, but again, the teacher-parent relationship or teacher-caregiver relationship is so important. And it's something that we also want to be very aware of.
Definitely. And like you said, it speaks to aligning that conversation between school and home earlier. So having teachers make that first call home or first conversation with a parent or caregiver being something positive. So you may have a child in your classroom that's tantruming and really exhibiting separation anxiety, but find something positive to share. Maybe they're really enthusiastic about coloring in crayons. Perfect. That's great. High energy and enthusiasm. Maybe a child is shyer. Maybe they're sort of hesitant to engage, but you notice that they're very observant, right? They're looking around, they're noticing. You may have another child that is very dedicated to finishing their projects or their work. So there's always ways to find the positive. And that really can also, like you said, for parents and caregivers to be positive and for teachers to be positive, especially as we go back into this really strange school year, this strange fall. Setting the foundation ahead, and that also helps align that conversation. So what children are hearing in the classroom is what they're hearing at home when adults are talking to them, but also when adults are talking to each other, that overheard conversation. So again, I think we've done a really nice job, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today, talking about social emotional learning, what it is, why it's important, what the research is, and how do we support young learners both at home and in school as we prepare to go back into a classroom for the first time in I'll say many moons.
Yes.
But yes, is there anything final you wanted to add, Erin? Any closing notes?
No, I think you summed it up really nicely. And thanks for having me do this with you. This was really fun.
Yeah. And for folks, again, if folks are more interested, Scientific Mommy, you can Google their website, check them out on Instagram. They really do a nice job. Robin and Erin do a nice job synthesizing a lot of academic jargon, big RCT, randomized control trials, and putting it into bite-sized information for parents, caregivers, fellow educators, for us to understand how we can better support children. Again, CASEL, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, is a fantastic resource on all things SEL. So if you're like, what was that again, or where do I find that? Check out their website. They're really a great resource. And additional programs like Sesame Street and PBS Learning provide what we would say is evidence-backed generally evidence-backed educational media. So instead of, if you're looking and you're worried about what to find, I would start there for great resources for children. But again, thank you, Erin, for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
And thanks, folks, for sitting through this kind of hybrid discussion. We're happy to have you.